This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. A bombshell report says President Trump instructed his former personal lawyer to lie to Congress. It opens new questions about obstruction, but the White House says it's ludicrous. A top North Korean negotiator comes to Washington, leading to an announcement there'll be a second summit between President Trump and Kim Jong-un next month. And play ball. Cuban baseball players are hoping a new agreement will lift their fortunes without forcing them to defect. Welcome to World News America. The White House is hitting back today against a report that President Trump directed his former personal lawyer to lie to Congress. BuzzFeed News says that Mr. Trump instructed Michael Cohen to lie about plans to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. A presidential spokesman dismissed the claims as ludicrous. Democrats say the allegations need to be investigated and that, if true, could constitute obstruction of justice and subornation of perjury. And North America editor John Sopel begins our coverage.
The subject that just won't go away, the president and Russia, and the most serious allegations to date about his attempts to hide the efforts the Trump Organization was making to build a Trump Tower in Moscow just before the election. After Donald Trump became president, his then personal lawyer Michael Cohen went before Congress and said on oath that the plan was scrapped in January 2016. That wasn't true, and a lie that earned him time in jail. But according to a detailed BuzzFeed report, the lie wasn't his idea. The special counsel's office learned about Trump's directive for Cohen to lie to Congress through interviews with multiple witnesses from the Trump Organization and internal company emails, text messages, and a cache of other documents. And the report goes on. The president personally instructed him to lie by claiming that negotiations ended months earlier than they actually did in order to obscure Trump's involvement. The president's current personal attorney, Rudy Giuliani, has categorically denied this. The White House has been more circumspect.
This is just another in a long line of ridiculous charges without any corroboration or credibility whatsoever.
You're saying the president did not tell Michael Cohen to do that?
I'm telling you right now, this is exactly why the president refuses to give any credence or credibility to news outlets, because they have no ability to corroborate anything they're putting out there. Instead, they're just using innuendo and shady sources.
That was not a denial of my question.
No, but the premise is ridiculous.
And the president's press secretary stuck rigidly to quoting Rudy Giuliani's words.
Look, that's absolutely ridiculous. I think that the president's outside counsel addressed this best and said in a statement earlier today that's categorically false.
The chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff, tweeted this: "The allegation that the President of the United States may have suborned perjury before our committee in an effort to curtail the investigation and cover up his business dealings with Russia is among the most serious to date. We will do what's necessary to find out if it's true." Suborned perjury? That phrase has been used a couple of times before. It's the charge that brought Richard Nixon down. It's the accusation that led to Bill Clinton too being impeached over lies that he told about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky.
The week started with the bizarre spectacle of the president feeling it necessary to come out before the cameras and say that he wasn't working for the Russians. It ends with him facing serious allegations of obstructing justice. The reason this is so significant is that obstruction of justice is considered a high crime and misdemeanor, something that can lead to impeachment. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, for more on this report and the legal implications, I'm joined now by former US Attorney Michael Moore from Atlanta. If these allegations are true, Mr. Moore, how serious could this be for the president?
This is really damning news for the president. And let me sort of put it in context for you from what has happened. If, in fact, the allegations are true, so if the story is true, and if, in fact, we are to believe Mr. Barr in his confirmation hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee, then it seems to me at this point that Mr. Barr has told us that this type of conduct would constitute an obstruction charge and would support an obstruction charge, then that essentially Trump will have hired his own hangman at this point. So it's a significant development, probably the strongest to date. What's particularly interesting as well is that Bob Mueller is a professional prosecutor. He's a tactician at this, and he understands about putting a case together. He also understands what to do when you have a witness whose credibility has been compromised, as we see here with Mr. Cohen, who's in fact been charged and pled guilty to giving false testimony before. What that means is that Bob Mueller and his team will have built the case not just relying on Michael Cohen's testimony. They will use other evidence, other corroborating evidence. Those may be emails, texts, they might be documents. There may be other witnesses who are familiar with it. We don't know who all's been in front of the grand jury. But that factor alone, and the fact that we're not dealing with a novice prosecutor, is damning news for the president.
And Mr. what would the burden of proof need to be in this situation?
Well, to convict someone of a crime, you've got to prove them guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's a very different standard than impeachment, which is in fact a political process, and the Congress would decide that, the House would decide that on whether or not to move forward with articles of impeachment, and then the Senate would make the decision, obviously, on whether or not he's convicted of the charges and ultimately removed from office. There's a question, of course, that's debated routinely between legal scholars on whether or not, in fact, you can indict a sitting president. I think it's likely in this kind of case that you might see an indictment which is sealed and not unsealed until such time as the president were to leave office. I just don't know that he can withstand the scrutiny at this point, especially when we see that they've essentially got him also by his Achilles heel, and that is his children. Because what we also know is that we've heard from Michael Cohen, and what we expect to hear in his congressional testimony coming up is that we've got involvement from his son and from his daughter Ivanka, and that further complicates the matter for Trump going forward.
And the BuzzFeed report does mention his children in that as part of those allegations.
That's
so
right.
How serious could that be for them, very briefly?
Well, I think it's very serious, and I think, you know, they obviously would expect a pardon from their father. The question is, would he do that, and how wrapped up are they in the lies and the falsehoods that were told about whether or not there was collusion or conspiracy, cooperation with Russia, and whether or not there are agreements there. This case has always been about following the money, and ultimately that's where we're going. We're going to follow the money back from Russia to the Trump organization.
Michael Moore, thanks very much for joining us.
Glad to be with you. Thank you.
Now, mark your calendars for the end of February. That's when the White House says a second summit will take place between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. The news came after North Korean negotiator Kim Jong-chol came to Washington. He first met with US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo before spending 90 minutes with President Trump in the Oval Office. Well, for more on what was discussed, I'm joined now by our State Department correspondent, Barbara Plett-Usher. So what more do we know about this upcoming summit?
We know it's going to take place in late February, although we don't have an exact date. We don't know the place. That's going to be announced later, but multiple reports suggest it's going to be Vietnam. We know that it took 90 minutes of a meeting in the Oval Office to get here, which is quite a long time. Presumably, Mr. Trump and his officials thrashing through the terms about what this would entail. But also, you know, Mr. Trump sees Kim Jong-un as a close friend. He's even said he's in love with him. So I rather suspect he also enjoyed the chat.
Now, it's been, since last June that they had that first summit in Singapore. What's happened since then to get to the point that they're now arranging a second meeting?
Well, that's a very good question, because talks have been blocked since then, and there's no obvious reason or explanation of any narrowing of the differences. And these differences being that the Americans want the North Koreans to dismantle their nuclear weapons up front before they get any sanctions relief. Kim Jong-un says no, that should happen in phases, and sanctions relief should begin now. And there's no clear sign that has been that there's any agreement about that. But perhaps the Americans will become a bit more flexible on the approach. Maybe they'll go to a more of a phased approach. Not the goal, though, denuclearization.
So denuclearization, you mentioned there, Barbara. I remember last time when we were talking about that first summit, how both sides have a different definition of what that is.
Yeah, they still do, and they never actually defined it in the last summit. It was very vague. So the Americans see denuclearization as getting rid of the nuclear program, verifying that it's gone, no nuclear weapons. The North Koreans define it more broadly. They see it also as removing what they see as U.S. threats to them. Now, that could mean pulling U.S. troops out of South Korea, could mean pulling out nuclear-capable submarines and bombers from the region. We don't know. They haven't actually clearly defined it, and that is one thing experts say should happen before this summit. Get North Korea to define what it means by that, and then get a roadmap to achieving it.
And we had the defence review that was published yesterday. President Trump announced it, saying North Korea is still a very significant threat.
Yeah, ironically, this week that was highlighted. You had the Missile Defense Review who said it was ongoing extraordinary threat. Now, it did note that there was a path to peace, but they said also you had to be very vigilant and there was a significant concern. So ironically, that happened in the same week as the path to peace appeared to open a little bit, maybe.
Barbara Pledasher, thanks very much. Now, some of the day's other news. The electric car maker Tesla's announced that it's going to cut 7% of its workers because its cars are still too expensive for most people. That means it will lay off more than 3,000 employees from the current workforce of more than 45,000. This is Tesla's second job cut in 7 months and comes just days after it cut US prices for all of its vehicles. In Poland, thousands of people have walked beside the coffin of Gdańsk's former mayor, Paweł Adamowicz, who was stabbed on stage at a charity event. A car drove the mayor's body to St. Mary's Basilica, where he will lie in state before the burial. Mr. Adamowicz was one of Poland's longest-serving mayors, who had run the city since 1998. He was a strong critic of the ruling party's anti-immigrant policies. It's the planet famous for its rings, but now scientists have confirmed that Saturn's iconic rings are younger than previously thought. They're on more than 100 million years old and may have formed during a time when dinosaurs still roamed on Earth. The insight comes from the final measurements acquired by the NASA's probe Cassini just before it drove itself to destruction in Saturn's atmosphere in 2017. Now, here in the US, many on the East Coast are bracing for a winter storm, but in eastern Australia, forecasters are warning an extreme heat wave may become even worse. Some areas in the state of New South Wales have already seen record temperatures of 48 degrees Celsius, causing roads to melt in the heat. Phil Mercer sent us this report from Sydney.
Even in a land well used to nature's extremes, this heat wave is punishing. The roasting conditions are affecting much of eastern Australia, but New South Wales is feeling it most. 2018 was Australia's third warmest year on record, and 2019 has got off to a scorching start. Residents in Whitecliffs, 1,000 kilometres from Sydney, have endured heat of 48.2 degrees Celsius. Other parts of Australia's most populous state have also set new temperature records. The beach and a soothing sea breeze have provided relief for many, as Australians do what they can to stay cool. Heat waves are Australia's deadliest natural hazard, and there are dangers not only for people, but also for animals. Frozen treats and ice cubes have helped echidnas and sea lions at Sydney's Taronga Zoo, while others have headed straight to the pool. There was also relief for a distressed sheep found abandoned with a sore leg in the New South Wales outback. It was rescued by a police officer and allowed to recover in an air-conditioned patrol car. Phil Mercer, BBC News, Sydney.
Next to Africa, where one of the continent's most repressive regimes is facing a growing popular uprising. Thousands of protesters have taken to the streets in Sudan, demanding an end to the rule of President Omar al-Bashir, who's ruled the country for 3 decades. In the latest violence, police shot dead unarmed demonstrators, including a 14-year-old boy. Dozens of people have been killed since protests began last month after an increase in the price of bread. Here's our Africa editor, Fergal Keane.
Mourning and defiant. This is the people's answer to a regime which can still inflict death, but whose capacity to impose a blanket of fear is being challenged as never before. Here, a police car is overturned. Symbol of a state accused of brutal torture and killings.
He was returning from prayers at the mosque nearby. As he approached the house, a policeman rushed at him. Moya resisted, but the policeman shot him through the door.
The worst of the violence was here in the Khartoum neighbourhood of Buri. here sharing vinegar used to try and deal with the after effects of tear gas. Shots echoing across the streets. Here, one of the savage beatings meted out during house raids. And this, the tragic moment when security forces opened fire on a stone-throwing crowd. A young protester was killed. Dr. Babkir Abdelhamid here undergoing emergency treatment. He was allegedly shot after pleading with police to stop firing outside a house where he was treating the wounded.
He started explaining that he's a medical doctor. The response he got was simply, "You are a medical doctor. Well, we are looking for you." And they took 2 steps back and they just shot him and then went away.
Dr. Abdelhamid died of his wounds. The protest began in the city of Atbara last December when the price of bread was tripled. On the following days, they spread to the capital, Khartoum. Now there are reports of fresh unrest in several cities. And last night, scenes outside this hospital in Buri were the most defiant yet. Omar al-Bashir came to power in a military coup in 1989. It was the brutality of his crackdown in Darfur, part of which we documented in 2005, that made him notorious and prompted a charge of genocide by the International Criminal Court. We filmed President Bashir recently when he visited the reformist Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Abiy Ahmed. 11 days later, driven by economic despair, the people rose up.
It is probably the end game for President Bashir. How long he will stay in office, whether it's a week or a year, is almost irrelevant. His regime, as far as the protesters in the street, has lost all credibility.
Hated by many of his own people, wanted for genocide, President Bashir has everything to lose if he falls. He must surely worry now that despite his crackdown, resistance seems only to be growing. Fergal Keane, BBC News.
You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. She captured the Clinton campaign with every click. Tonight we hear from the photographer what it was like behind the lens. Police say they're investigating the car crash involving the Duke of Edinburgh and will take any appropriate action. Prince Philip was unhurt, but 2 people in the other vehicle were injured. Helen Ali has been at the scene of the crash and sent us this report.
The Duke of Edinburgh was driving a Land Rover himself at the age of 97. He crossed over the A road and that's when he was in collision with another car. Now the police have given a few more details about the 2 women who were inside the other car. The driver, she had cuts to her knee and her passenger, she had a broken wrist. But incredibly, the Duke of Edinburgh didn't need to go to hospital. He was checked over by a doctor at the Sandringham estate and the doctor was satisfied that he wasn't injured at all. He, we understand, is now still recovering from the shock of that incident here on the estate and we understand the Queen is also with him.
Presidential campaigns are known for long days on the road and sleepless nights, even if you cover them too. Now, for one person on the staff, though, it was their job to capture every moment from rope lines to rallies and everything in between. Photographer Barbara Kinney followed Hillary Clinton for 20 months on the campaign trail. I spoke with her earlier about her behind-the-scenes look at history. Hillary Clinton described your book not as a record of what happened, but how the campaign felt. How do you think you conveyed that in your photography?
Well, I think that's exactly sort of what the purpose of the book. I wanted people to see, you know, how hard we worked, how hard she worked, what a campaign's like, the grueling part of it, the, you know, late nights and long days, and I wanted to show that to people because, you know, most people just see her at an event giving a speech, right? And so it was, yeah, it's a really good record, I think, of how hard we worked.
You took Hundreds of thousands of photos.
432,000.
Wow,
yes.
that's a lot of photos. How do you decide which ones make the final cut?
Just editing. I mean, after each event, after each day, I'd go through my images and pick out what we wanted to post on the Hillary Clinton Flickr site. So I'd go through and pick out the best, you know, event photos, candids, and when we did the book, I went back. Warren, my publisher, did most of the editing, but we went back to look at those selects to see. But then there are also, in the haste of editing so quickly, you miss a few gems, and so he was able to go back through and also when there's some time, a distance between the campaign and actually editing, it gives a different feeling to some of the pictures.
We've got some of your photos here.
It's great.
Which ones really stand out for you now? You say you've got a bit of distance to look at those pictures.
Wow. It's so hard. People ask me which one is my favorite, and it's hard to say. I love the one of Secretary Clinton and Obama laughing. That was just a really special moment. They were by themselves after his speech at the convention, and myself and Pete Souza, his photographer, were the only ones back there. And it was just this really great moment that we're able to capture. I like the pictures of her when you see her by herself, either working on her speech or in a moment, even by herself, but even people could be all around her, but she's in this quiet moment. Those are the ones that speak to me because they're real, you know.
And you talk about this being the election of the selfie, and we saw Hillary Clinton take a lot of selfies with people. You know, why do you think that really changed things? Well,
I mentioned this in the intro of my book. I noticed in the beginning of the campaign that there was a different feel to the campaign than the one I did in 2008 and some other times when I was at the White House covering President Clinton. I was missing something, and I finally figured it out, that the interaction that she would have with people on the rope line after she gives a speech, she comes down and shakes hands. And she would talk to people and have great interactions, and you'd see faces and emotions. And now all people want are selfies. And so there's a little bit of spontaneity that is, and emotion that is missing. But people have to have that selfie. And you know, it makes for great photos for us, for myself and the other press photographers, but that you miss the interaction. I mean, there's a picture back here of this little girl, you know, just beside herself, and those are the kinds of things that, you know, I missed seeing as much of.
Barbara Kinney, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Right now, relations between the Trump administration and Cuba are rocky, to say the least. But despite the diplomatic hostility, an important breakthrough has been made in sport. Major League Baseball here in the US and Cuba's Baseball Federation have reached a deal in December, which lets Cuban players sign with American teams without defecting from the communist-run nation. From Havana, Will Grant reports on the impact.
Cuban baseball is on the verge of a breakthrough. Yosvani Peñaver is one of the best youth players on the island and spends hours a week practicing his swing. Now a new agreement could take him to Major League Baseball in the US. And unlike the past, he wouldn't have to defect.
There's going to be a complete change, 100%. If until now we have been playing for the love of baseball, now there's going to be something extra. There will be scouts watching us from the stands, and that's sure to make the players try harder.
It's both exciting and tempting for hundreds of players in Cuba who've seen many of their baseball heroes flee over the years, often on risky journeys via people-smuggling gangs.
The plus side of this new arrangement is pretty clear. For these players, if they're good enough, their prospects of playing Major League Baseball in the US just rose exponentially almost overnight. And Cuba hopes it means the brain drain in baseball of permanently seeing their best talent flee to the US is also over.
The groundwork for the agreement was made during a period of much warmer relations between Cuba and the US. In 2016, President Obama made a historic visit to the island and took in a game with Raul Castro in Havana. Cuba certainly has the talent, but lacks much of the infrastructure, something the government here blames on the US economic embargo. Many in Cuban baseball hope the deal will help the grassroots game.
It'll be good for us too. We'll take a percentage through our federation, and that will be used for grassroots, for infrastructure, for baseball in general.
Despite the opportunity for young Cuban players, some still oppose the deal, particularly Senator Marco Rubio of Florida, who wants the Trump administration to overturn it. Others simply regret it didn't happen sooner.
Honestly, I would have loved to have played in the Major League, not just for the financial side, although obviously that's attractive too, but I'd have liked the chance to test myself by playing in the very elite of world baseball.
If it moves forward, the deal between Cuba and the Major League could be mutually beneficial and may finally stop Cuba's talented youngsters risking their lives to defect. This generation may be the one that plays baseball in the US with Cuba's blessing. Will Grant, BBC News, Havana.
And Cuban baseball is where we end this programme. You can find more on our website. I'm at Twitter at BBC Rajini V. I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Thanks for watching BBC World News America.